Chapter 18 of the New Magdalen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The New Magdalen by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 18 The Search in the Grounds. Grace Roseberry, still listening in the conservatory, saw the door open, and recognized the mistress of the house. She softly drew back, and placed herself in safer hiding, beyond the range of view from the dining room. Lady Janet advanced no further than the threshold. She stood there and looked at her nephew and her adopted daughter in stern silence. Mercy dropped into the chair at her side. Julian kept his place by her. His mind was still stunned by the discovery that had burst on it. His eyes still rested on her in mute terror of inquiry. He was as completely absorbed in the one act of looking at her as if they had been still alone together in the room. Lady Janet was the first of the three who spoke. She addressed herself to her nephew. "You were right, Mr. Julian Gray," she said, with her bitterest emphasis of tone and manner. "You ought to have found nobody in this house on your return but me. I detain you no longer. You are free to leave my house." Julian looked round at his aunt. She was pointing to the door. In the excited state of his sensibilities at that moment, the action stung him to the quick. He answered without his customary consideration for his aunt's age and his aunt's position towards him. "You apparently forget, Lady Janet, that you are not speaking to one of your footmen," he said. "There are serious reasons, of which you know nothing, for my remaining in your house a little longer. You may rely upon my trespassing on your hospitality as short a time as possible." He turned again to Mercy as he said those words, and surprised her timidly looking up at him. In the instant when their eyes met, the tumult of emotion struggling in him became suddenly stilled. Sorrow for her, compassionating sorrow, rose in the new calm and filled his heart. Now, and now only, he could read in the wasted and noble face how she had suffered. The pity which he had felt for the unnamed woman grew to a tenfold pity for her. The faith which he professed, honestly professed, in the better nature of the unnamed woman strengthened into a tenfold faith in her. He addressed himself again to his aunt in a gentler tone. "This lady," he resumed, "has something to say to me in private which she has not said yet. That is my reason, and my apology for not immediately leaving the house." Still under the impression of what she had seen on entering the room, Lady Janet looked at him in angry amazement. Was Julian actually ignoring Horace Holmcroft's claim in the presence of Horace Holmcroft's betrothed wife? She appealed to her adopted daughter. "Grace!" she exclaimed, "have you heard him? Have you nothing to say? Must I remind you?" She stopped. For the first time in Lady Janet's experience of her young companion, she found herself speaking to ears that were deaf to her. Mercy was incapable of listening. Julian's eyes had told her that Julian understood her at last. Lady Janet turned to her nephew once more, and addressed him in the hardest words that she had ever spoken to her sister's son. "If you have any sense of decency," she said, "I will say nothing of a sense of honor, you will leave this house, and your acquaintance with that lady will end here. Spare me your protests and excuses. I can place but one interpretation of what I saw when I opened that door." "You entirely misunderstand what you saw when you opened that door," Julian answered, quietly. "Perhaps I misunderstood the confession which you made to me not an hour ago," retorted Lady Janet. Julian cast a look of alarm at Mercy. "Don't speak of it," he said, in a whisper. "She might hear you." "Do you mean to say she doesn't know you are in love with her?" "Thank God she has not the faintest suspicion of it." There was no mistaking the earnestness with which he made that reply. It proved his innocence as nothing else could have proved it. Lady Janet drew back a step, utterly bewildered, completely at a loss what to say or what to do next. The silence that followed was broken by a knock at the library door. The manservant, with news and bad news legibly written in his disturbed face and manner, entered the room. In the nervous irritability of the moment, Lady Janet resented the servant's appearance as a positive offense on the part of the harmless man. "Who sent for you?" she asked, sharply. What do you mean by interrupting us?" The servant made his excuses in an oddly bewildered manner. "I beg your ladyship's pardon. I wished to take the liberty—I wanted to speak to Mr. Julian Gray." "What is it?" asked Julian. The man looked uneasily at Lady Janet, hesitated, and glanced at the door, as if he wished himself well out of the room again. "I hardly know if I can tell you, sir, before her ladyship," he answered. Lady Janet instantly penetrated the secret of her servant's hesitation. "I know what has happened," she said. "That abominable woman has found her way here again. Am I right?" The man's eyes helplessly consulted Julian. "Yes or no?" cried Lady Janet, imperatively. "Yes, my lady." Julian at once assumed the duty of asking the necessary questions. "Where is she?" he began. "Somewhere in the grounds, as we suppose, sir." "Did you see her?" "No, sir." "Who saw her?" "The lodge keeper's wife." This looked serious. The lodge keeper's wife had been present while Julian had given his instructions to her husband. She was not likely to have mistaken the identity of the person whom she had discovered. "How long since?" Julian asked next. "Not very long, sir." "Be more particular. How long?" "I didn't hear, sir." "Did the lodge keeper's wife speak to the person when she saw her?" "No, sir. She didn't get the chance, as I understand it. She is a stout woman, if you remember. The other was too quick for her. Discovered her, sir, and, as the saying is, gave her the slip." "In what part of the grounds did this happen?" The servant pointed in the direction of the side hall. "In that part, sir. Either in the Dutch garden or the shrubbery. I am not sure which." It was plain, by this time, that the man's information was too imperfect to be practically of any use. Julian asked if the lodge keeper's wife was in the house. "No, sir. Her husband has gone out to search the grounds in her place, and she is minding the gate. They sent their boy with the message. From what I can make out from the lad, they would be thankful if they could get a word more of advice from you, sir." Julian reflected for a moment. So far as he could estimate them, the probabilities were that the stranger from Mannheim had already made her way into the house; that she had been listening in the billiard room; that she had found time enough to escape him on his approaching to open the door; and that she was now, in the servant's phrase, somewhere in the grounds, after eluding the pursuit of the lodge keeper's wife. The matter was serious. Any mistake in dealing with it might lead to very painful results. If Julian had correctly anticipated the nature of the confession which Mercy had been on the point of addressing to him, the person whom he had been the means of introducing into the house was, what she had vainly asserted herself to be, no other than the true Grace Roseberry. Taking this for granted, it was of the utmost importance that he should speak to Grace privately, before she committed herself to any rashly renewed assertion of her claims, and before she could gain access to Lady Janet's adopted daughter. The landlady at her lodgings had already warned him that the object which she held steadily in view was to find her way to Miss Roseberry when Lady Janet was not present to take her part, and when no gentlemen were at hand to protect her. "Only let me meet her face to face," she had said, "and I will make her confess herself the impostor that she is." As matters now stood, it was impossible to estimate too seriously the mischief which might ensue from such a meeting as this. Everything now depended on Julian's skillful management of an exasperated woman, and nobody, at that moment, knew where the woman was. In this position of affairs, as Julian understood it, there seemed to be no other alternative than to make his inquiries instantly at the lodge, and then to direct the search in person. He looked towards Mercy's chair as he arrived at this resolution. It was at a cruel sacrifice of his own anxieties and his own wishes that he deferred continuing the conversation with her from the critical point at which Lady Janet's appearance had interrupted it. Mercy had risen while he had been questioning the servant. The attention which she had failed to accord to what had passed between his aunt and himself she had given to the imperfect statement which he had extracted from the man. Her face plainly showed that she had listened as eagerly as Lady Janet had listened, with this remarkable difference between them, that Lady Janet looked frightened, and that Lady Janet's companion showed no signs of alarm. She appeared to be interested, perhaps anxious, nothing more. Julian spoke a parting word to his aunt. "Pray compose yourself," he said. "I have little doubt, when I can learn the particulars, that we shall easily find this person in the grounds. There is no reason to be uneasy. I am going to superintend the search myself. I will return to you as soon as possible." Lady Janet listened absently. There was a certain expression in her eyes which suggested to Julian that her mind was busy with some project of its own. He stopped as he passed Mercy, on his way out by the billiard room door. It cost him a hard effort to control the contending emotions which the mere act of looking at her now awakened in him. His heart beat fast. His voice sank low as he spoke to her. "You shall see me again," he said. "I never was more in earnest in promising you my truest help and sympathy than I am now." She understood him. Her bosom heaved painfully. Her eyes fell to the ground. She made no reply. The tears rose in Julian's eyes as he looked at her. He hurriedly left the room. When he turned to close the billiard room door, he heard Lady Janet say, "I will be with you again in a moment, Grace. Don't go away." Interpreting these words as meaning that his aunt had some business of her own to attend to in the library, he shut the door. He had just advanced into the smoking room beyond, when he thought he heard the door open again. He turned round. Lady Janet had followed him. "Do you wish to speak to me?" he asked. "I want something of you," Lady Janet answered, "before you go." "What is it?" "Your card." "My card?" "You have just told me not to be uneasy," said the old lady. "I am uneasy, for all that. I don't feel as sure as you do that this woman really is in the grounds. She may be lurking somewhere in the house, and she may appear when your back is turned. Remember what you told me." Julian understood the allusion. He made no reply. "The people at the police station close by," pursued Lady Janet, "have instructions to send an experienced man, in plain clothes, to any address indicated on your card the moment they receive it. That is what you told me. For Grace's protection I want your card before you leave us." It was impossible for Julian to mention the reasons which now forbade him to make use of his own precautions, in the very face of the emergency which they had been especially intended to meet. How could he declare the true Grace Roseberry to be mad? How could he give the true Grace Roseberry into custody? On the other hand, he had personally pledged himself, when the circumstances appeared to require it, to place the means of legal protection from insult and annoyance at his aunt's disposal. And now there stood Lady Janet, unaccustomed to have her wishes disregarded by anybody, with her hand extended, waiting for the card. What was to be done? The one way out of the difficulty appeared to be to submit for the moment. If he succeeded in discovering the missing woman, he could easily take care that she should be subjected to no needless indignity. If she contrived to slip into the house in his absence, he could provide against that contingency by sending a second card privately to the police station, forbidding the officer to stir in the affair until he had received further orders. Julian made one stipulation only before he handed his card to his aunt. "You will not use this, I am sure, without positive and pressing necessity," he said. "But I must make one condition. Promise me to keep my plan for communicating with the police a strict secret." "A strict secret from Grace?" interposed Lady Janet. Julian bowed. "Do you suppose I want to frighten her? Do you think I have not had anxiety enough about her already? Of course I shall keep it a secret from Grace." Reassured on this point, Julian hastened out into the grounds. As soon as his back was turned, Lady Janet lifted the gold pencil case which hung at her watch chain, and wrote on her nephew's card, for the information of the officer in plain clothes, "You are wanted at Mablethorpe House." This done, she put the card into the old fashioned pocket of her dress, and returned to the dining room. Grace was waiting, in obedience to the instructions which she had received. For the first moment or two not a word was spoken on either side. Now that she was alone with her adopted daughter, a certain coldness and hardness began to show itself in Lady Janet's manner. The discovery that she had made on opening the drawing room door still hung on her mind. Julian had certainly convinced her that she had misinterpreted what she had seen, but he had convinced her against her will. She had found Mercy deeply agitated, suspiciously silent. Julian might be innocent, she admitted. There was no accounting for the vagaries of men. But the case of Mercy was altogether different. Women do not find themselves in the arms of men without knowing what they were about. Acquitting Julian, Lady Janet declined to acquit Mercy. "There is some secret understanding between them," thought the old lady, "and she's to blame. The women always are." Mercy still waited to be spoken to, pale and quiet, silent and submissive. Lady Janet, in a highly uncertain state of temper, was obliged to begin. "My dear!" she called out, sharply. "Yes, Lady Janet?" "How much longer are you going to sit there with your mouth shut up and your eyes on the carpet? Have you no opinion to offer on this alarming state of affairs? You heard what the man said to Julian. I saw you listening. Are you horribly frightened?" "No, Lady Janet." "Not even nervous?" "No, Lady Janet." "Ha! I should hardly have given you credit for so much courage after my experience of you a week ago. I congratulate you on your recovery." "Thank you, Lady Janet." "I am not so composed as you are. We were an excitable set in my youth, and I haven't got the better of it yet. I feel nervous. Do you hear? I feel nervous." "I am sorry, Lady Janet." "You are very good. Do you know what I am going to do?" "No, Lady Janet." "I am going to summon the household. When I say the household, I mean the men. The women are no use. I am afraid I fail to attract your attention?" "You have my best attention, Lady Janet." "You are very good again. I said the women were of no use." "Yes, Lady Janet." "I mean to place a manservant on guard at every entrance to the house. I am going to do it at once. Will you come with me?" "Can I be of any use if I go with your ladyship?" "You can't be of the slightest use. I give the orders in this house, not you. I had quite another motive in asking you to come with me. I am more considerate of you than you seem to think. I don't like leaving you here by yourself. Do you understand?" "I am much obliged to your ladyship. I don't mind being left here by myself." "You don't mind! I never heard of such heroism in my life. Out of a novel. Suppose that crazy wretch should find her way in here?" "She would not frighten me this time, as she has frightened me before." "Not too fast, my young lady. Suppose Good heavens! Now I think of it, there is a conservatory. Suppose she should be hidden in there? Julian is searching the grounds. Who is to search the conservatory?" "With your ladyship's permission, I will search the conservatory." "You?" "With your ladyship's permission."
I can hardly believe my own ears. Well, live and learn is an old proverb. I thought I knew your character. This is a change."
"You forget, Lady Janet, if I may venture to say so, that the circumstances are changed. She took me by surprise on the last occasion. I am prepared for her now."
"Do you really feel as coolly as you speak?"
"Yes, Lady Janet."
"Have your own way, then. I shall do one thing, however, in case of your having overestimated your own courage. I shall place one of the men in the library. You will only have to ring for him if anything happens. He will give the alarm, and I shall act accordingly. I have my plan," said her ladyship, comfortably conscious of the card in her pocket. "Don't look as if you wanted to know what it is. I have no intention of saying anything about it, except that it will do. Once more, and for the last time, do you stay here, or do you go with me?"
"I stay here." She respectfully opened the library door for Lady Janet's departure as she made that reply. Throughout the interview she had been carefully and coldly deferential. She had not once lifted her eyes to Lady Janet's face. The conviction in her that a few hours more would, in all probability, see her dismissed from the house, had of necessity fettered every word that she spoke, had morally separated her already from the injured mistress whose love she had won in disguise. Utterly incapable of attributing the change in her young companion to the true motive, Lady Janet left the room to summon her domestic garrison, thoroughly puzzled and, as a necessary consequence of that condition, thoroughly displeased. Still holding the library door in her hand, Mercy stood watching with a heavy heart the progress of her benefactress down the length of the room on the way to the front hall beyond. She had honestly loved and respected the warm hearted, quick tempered old lady. A sharp pang of pain wrung her as she thought of the time when even the chance utterance of her name would become an unpardonable offense in Lady Janet's house. But there was no shrinking in her now from the ordeal of the confession. She was not only anxious, she was impatient for Julian's return. Before she slept that night, Julian's confidence in her should be a confidence that she had deserved. Let her own the truth, without the base fear of discovery to drive her to it. Let her do justice to the woman whom she has wronged, while that woman is still powerless to expose her. Let her sacrifice everything that she has gained to the fraud of the sacred duty of atonement. If she can do that, then her repentance has nobly revealed the noble nature that is in her, then she is a woman to be trusted, respected, beloved. Those words were as vividly present to her as if she still heard them falling from his lips. Those other words which had followed them rang as grandly as ever in her ears. "Rise, poor wounded heart! Beautiful, purified soul, God's angels rejoice over you! Take your place among the noblest of God's creatures." Did the woman live who could hear Julian Gray say that, and who could hesitate, at any sacrifice, at any loss, to justify his belief in her? "Oh," she thought longingly while her eyes followed Lady Janet to the end of the library, "if your worst fears could only be realized! If I could only see Grace Roseberry in this room, how fearlessly I could meet her now!" She closed the library door, while Lady Janet opened the other door which led into the hall. As she turned and looked back into the dining room, a cry of astonishment escaped her. There, as if in answer to the aspiration which was still in her mind, there, established in triumph on the chair that she had just left, sat Grace Roseberry, in sinister silence, waiting for her. End of chapter 18. Recording by Todd. Chapter 19 of the New Magdalen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The New Magdalen, by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 19. The Evil Genius. Recovering from the first overpowering sensation of surprise, Mercy rapidly advanced, eager to say her first penitent words. Grace stopped her by a warning gesture of the hand. "No nearer to me," she said, with a look of contemptuous command. "Stay where you are." Mercy paused. Grace's reception had startled her. She instinctively took the chair nearest to her to support herself. Grace raised a warning hand for the second time, and issued another command. "I forbid you to be seated in my presence. You have no right to be in this house at all. Remember, if you please, who you are, and who I am." The tone in which these words were spoken was an insult in itself. Mercy suddenly lifted her head. The angry answer was on her lips. She checked it, and submitted in silence. "I will be worthy of Julian Gray's confidence in me," she thought, as she stood patiently by the chair. "I will bear anything from the woman whom I have wronged." In silence the two faced each other, alone together, for the first time since they had met in the French cottage. The contrast between them was strange to see. Grace Roseberry, seated in her chair, little and lean, with her dull white complexion, with her hard, threatening face, with her shrunken figure clad in its plain and poor black garments, looked like a being of a lower sphere compared with Mercy Merrick, standing erect in her rich silken dress, her tall, shapely figure towering over the little creature before her, her grand head bent in graceful submission, gentle, patient, beautiful, a woman whom it was a privilege to look at and a distinction to admire. If a stranger had been told that those two had played their parts in a romance of real life, that one of them was really connected by the ties of relationship with Lady Janet Roy, and that the other had successfully attempted to personate her, he would inevitably, if it had been left to him to guess which was which, have picked out Grace as the counterfeit, and Mercy as the true woman. Grace broke the silence. She had waited to open her lips until she had eyed her conquered victim all over, with disdainful minute attention, from head to foot. "Stand there! I like to look at you," she said, speaking with a spiteful relish of her own cruel words. "It's no use fainting this time. You have not got Lady Janet Roy to bring you to. There are no gentlemen here to day to pity you and pick you up. Mercy Merrick, I have got you at last. Thank God, my turn has come. You can't escape me now." All the littleness of heart and mind which had first shown itself in Grace at the meeting in the cottage, when Mercy had told the sad story of her life, now revealed itself once more. The woman who in those past times had felt no impulse to take a suffering and a penitent fellow creature by the hand, was the same woman who could feel no pity, who would spare no insolence of triumph now. Mercy's sweet voice answered her patiently, in low, pleading tones. "I have not avoided you," she said.
I would have gone to you of my own accord if I had known that you were here. It is my heartfelt wish to own that I have sinned against you, and to make all the atonement that I can. I am too anxious to deserve your forgiveness to have any fear of seeing you." Conciliatory as the reply was, it was spoken with a simple and modest dignity of manner which roused Grace Roseberry to fury. "How dare you speak to me as if you were any equal?" she burst out. "You stand there and answer me as if you had your right and your place in this house. You audacious woman! I have my right and my place here, and what am I obliged to do? I am obliged to hang about in the grounds, and fly from the sight of the servants, and hide like a thief, and wait like a beggar, and all for what? For the chance of having a word with you! Yes, you, madam, with the air of the refuge and the dirt of the streets on you!" Mercy's head sank lower. Her hand trembled as it held by the back of the chair. It was hard to bear the reiterated insults heaped on her, but Julian's influence still made itself felt. She answered as patiently as ever. "If it is your pleasure to use hard words to me," she said, "I have no right to resent them." "You have no right to anything," Grace retorted. "You have no right to the gown on your back. Look at yourself, and look at me." Her eyes traveled with a tigerish stare over Mercy's costly silk dress. "Who gave you that dress? Who gave you those jewels? I know. Lady Janet gave them to Grace Roseberry. Are you Grace Roseberry? That dress is mine. Take off your bracelets and your brooch. They were meant for me." "You may soon have them, Miss Roseberry. They will not be in my possession many hours longer." "What do you mean?" "However badly you may use me, it is my duty to undo the harm that I have done. I am bound to do you justice. I am determined to confess the truth." Grace smiled scornfully. "You confess?" she said. "Do you think I am fool enough to believe that? You are one shameful brazen lie from head to foot. Are you the woman to give up your silks and your jewels, and your position in this house, and go back to the refuge of your own accord? Not you! Not you!" A first faint flush of color showed itself, stealing slowly over Mercy's face, but she still held resolutely by the good influence which Julian had left behind him. She could still say to herself, anything rather than disappoint Julian Gray. Sustained by the courage which he had called to life in her, she submitted to her martyrdom as bravely as ever. But there was an ominous change in her now. She could only submit in silence. She could no longer trust herself to answer. The mute endurance in her face additionally exasperated Grace Roseberry. "You won't confess," she went on. "You have had a week to confess in, and you have not done it yet. No, no! You are of the sort that cheat and lie to the last. I am glad of it. I shall have the joy of exposing you myself before the whole house. I shall be the blessed means of casting you back on the streets. Oh! It will be almost worth all I have gone through to see you with a policeman's hand on your arm, and the mob pointing at you and mocking you on your way to jail." This time the sting struck deep. The outrage was beyond endurance. Mercy gave the woman who had again and again deliberately insulted her a first warning. "Miss Roseberry," she said, "I have borne without a murmur the bitterest words you could say to me. Spare me any more insults. Indeed, indeed, I am eager to restore you to your just rights. With my whole heart I say to you, I am resolved to confess everything." She spoke with trembling earnestness of tone. Grace listened with a hard smile of incredulity and a hard look of contempt. "You are not far from the bell," she said. "Ring it." Mercy looked at her in speechless surprise. "You are a perfect picture of repentance. You are dying to own the truth," pursued the other, satirically. "Own it before everybody, and own it at once. Call in Lady Janet. Call in Mr. Gray and Mr. Holmcroft. Call in the servants. Go down on your knees and acknowledge yourself an impostor before them all. Then I will believe you, not before." "Don't turn me against you," cried Mercy, entreatingly. "What do I care whether you are against me or not?" "Don't, for your own sake. Don't go on provoking me much longer." "For my own sake! You insolent creature! Do you mean to threaten me?" With a last desperate effort, her heart beating faster and faster, the blood burning hotter and hotter in her cheeks, Mercy still controlled herself. "Have some compassion on me," she pleaded. "Badly as I have behaved to you, I am still a woman like yourself. I can't face the shame of acknowledging what I have done before the whole house. Lady Janet treats me like a daughter. Mr. Holmcroft has engaged himself to marry me. I can't tell Lady Janet and Mr. Holmcroft to their faces that I have cheated them out of their love. But they shall know it, for all that. I can, and will, before I rest to-night, tell the whole truth to Mr. Julian Gray." Grace burst out laughing. "Ha, ha, ha!" she exclaimed with a cynical outburst of gaiety. "Now we have come to it at last." "Take care," said Mercy. "Take care." "Mr. Julian Gray! I was behind the billiard-room door. I saw you coax Mr. Julian Gray to come in. Confession loses all its horrors and becomes quite a luxury with Mr. Julian Gray." "No more, Miss Roseberry, no more. For God's sake, don't put me beside myself. You have tortured me enough already." "You haven't been on the streets for nothing. You are a woman with resources. You know the value of having two strings to your bow. If Mr. Holmcroft fails you, you have got Mr. Julian Gray. Ah, you sicken me! I'll see that Mr. Holmcroft's eyes are opened. He shall know what a woman he might have married but for me." She checked herself. The next refinement of insult remained suspended on her lips. The woman whom she had outraged suddenly advanced on her. Her eyes, staring helplessly upward, saw Mercy Merrick's face, white with the terrible anger which drives the blood back on the heart, bending threateningly over her. "You will see that Mr. Holmcroft's eyes are opened?" Mercy slowly repeated. "He shall know what a woman he might have married but for you?" She paused, and followed those words by a question which struck a creeping terror through Grace Roseberry from the hair of her head to the soles of her feet. "Who are you?" The suppressed fury of look and tone which accompanied that question told, as no violence could have told it, that the limits of Mercy's endurance had been found at last. In the guardian angel's absence the evil genius had done its evil work. The better nature which Julian Gray had brought to life sank, poisoned by the vile venom of a womanly spiteful tongue. An easy and a terrible means of avenging the outrages heaped on her was within Mercy's reach if she chose to take it. In the frenzy of her indignation she never hesitated. She took it. "Who are you?" she asked for the second time. Grace roused herself and attempted to speak. Mercy stopped her with a scornful gesture of her hand. "I remember," she went on, with the same fiercely suppressed rage. "You are the madwoman from the German hospital who came here a week ago. I am not afraid of you this time. Sit down and rest yourself, Mercy Merrick." Deliberately giving her that name to her face, Mercy turned from her and took the chair which Grace had forbidden her to occupy when the interview began. Grace started to her feet. "What does this mean?" she asked. "It means," answered Mercy contemptuously, "that I recall every word I said to you just now. It means that I am resolved to keep my place in this house." "Are you out of your senses?" "You are not far from the bell. Ring it. Do what you asked me to do. Call in the whole household, and ask them which of us is mad, you or I." "Mercy Merrick, you shall repent this to the last hour of your life." Mercy rose again, and fixed her flashing eyes on the woman who still defied her. "I have had enough of you," she said. "Leave the house while you can leave it. Stay here, and I will send for Lady Janet Roy." "You can't send for her! You daren't send for her!" "I can, and I dare. You have not a shadow of a proof against me. I have got the papers. I am in possession of the place. I have established myself in Lady Janet's confidence. I mean to deserve your opinion of me. I will keep my dresses and my jewels in my position in the house. I deny that I have done wrong. Society has used me cruelly. I owe nothing to society. I have a right to take any advantage of it if I can. I deny that I have injured you. How was I to know that you would come to life again? Have I degraded your name and your character? I have done honor to both. I have won everybody's liking and everybody's respect. Do you think Lady Janet would have loved you as she loves me? Not she. I tell you to your face, I have filled the false position more creditably than you could have filled the true one, and I mean to keep it. I won't give up your name. I won't restore your character. Do your worst. I defy you." She poured out those reckless words in one headlong flow which defied interruption. There was no answering her until she was too breathless to say more. Grace seized her opportunity the moment it was within her reach. "You defy me!" she returned resolutely. "You won't defy me long. I have written to Canada. My friends will speak for me." "What of it, if they do? Your friends are strangers here. I am Lady Janet's adopted daughter. Do you think she will believe your friends? She will believe me. She will burn their letters if they write. She will forbid the house to them if they come. I shall be Mrs. Horace Holmcroft in a week's time. Who can shake my position? Who can injure me? Wait a minute, you forget the matron at the Refuge. Find her if you can. I never told you her name. I never told you where the Refuge was. I will advertise your name and find the matron in that way. Advertise in every newspaper in London. Do you think I gave a stranger like you the name I really bore in the Refuge? I gave you the name I assumed when I left England. No such person as Mercy Merrick is known to the matron. No such person is known to Mr. Holmcroft. He saw me at the French cottage while you were senseless on the bed. I had my grey cloak on. Neither he nor any of them saw me in my nurse's dress. Inquiries have been made about me on the Continent, and, I happen to know from the person who made them, with no result. I am safe in your place. I am known by your name. I am Grace Roseberry, and you are Mercy Merrick. Disprove it if you can." Summing up the unassailable security of her false position in those closing words, Mercy pointed significantly to the billiard-room door. "You were hiding there, by your own confession," she said. "You know your way out by that door. Will you leave the room?" "I won't stir a step." Mercy walked to a side table and struck the bell placed upon it. At the same moment the billiard-room door opened. Julian Gray appeared, returning from his unsuccessful search in the grounds. He had barely crossed the threshold before the library door was thrown open next by the servant posted in the room. The man drew back respectfully, and gave admission to Lady Janet Roy. She was followed by Horace Holmcroft, with his mother's wedding present to Mercy in his hand. End of Chapter 19. Recording by Todd.
Chapter 20 of The New Magdalen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois. The New Magdalen by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 20. The Policeman in Plain Clothes. Julian looked round the room, and stopped at the door which he had just opened. His eyes rested first on Mercy, next on Grace. The disturbed faces of both the women told him but too plainly that the disaster which he had dreaded had actually happened. They had met without any third person to interfere between them. To what extremities the hostile interview might have led, it was impossible for him to guess. In his aunt's presence he could only wait his opportunity of speaking to Mercy, and be ready to interpose if anything was ignorantly done which might give just cause of offense to Grace. Lady Janet's course of action, on entering the dining-room, was in perfect harmony with Lady Janet's character. Instantly discovering the intruder, she looked sharply at Mercy. "What did I tell you?" she asked. "Are you frightened?" "No, not in the least frightened." "Wonderful." She turned to the servant. "Wait in the library. I may want you again." She looked at Julian. "Leave it all to me. I can manage it." She made a sign to Horace. "Stay where you are, and hold your tongue." Having now said all that was necessary to everyone else, she advanced to the part of the room in which Grace was standing, with lowering brows and firmly shut lips, defiant of everybody. "I have no desire to offend you, or to act harshly toward you," her ladyship began very quietly. "I only suggest that your visits to my house cannot possibly lead to any satisfactory result. I hope you will not oblige me to say any harder words than these. I hope you will understand that I wish you to withdraw." The order of dismissal could hardly have been issued with more humane consideration for the supposed mental infirmity of the person to whom it was addressed. Grace instantly resisted it in the plainest possible terms. "In justice to my father's memory and in justice to myself," she answered, "I insist on a hearing. I refuse to withdraw." She deliberately took a chair and seated herself in the presence of the mistress of the house. Lady Janet waited a moment, steadily controlling her temper. In the interval of silence, Julian seized the opportunity of remonstrating with Grace. "Is this what you promised me?" he asked, gently. "You gave me your word that you would not return to Mablethorpe House." Before he could say more, Lady Janet had got her temper under command. She began her answer to Grace by pointing with a peremptory forefinger to the library door. "If you have not made up your mind to take my advice by the time I have walked back to that door," she said, "I will put it out of your power to set me at defiance. I am used to be obeyed, and I will be obeyed. You force me to use harsh words. I warn you before it is too late. Go." She returned slowly toward the library. Julian attempted to interfere with another word of remonstrance. His aunt stopped him by a gesture which said, plainly, "I insist on acting for myself." He looked next at Mercy. Would she remain passive? Yes. She never lifted her head. She never moved from the place in which she was standing apart from the rest. Horace himself tried to attract her attention, and tried in vain. Arrived at the library door, Lady Janet looked over her shoulder at the little immovable black figure in the chair. "Will you go?" she asked, for the last time. Grace started up angrily from her seat, and fixed her viperish eyes on Mercy. "I won't be turned out of your ladyship's house in the presence of that impostor," she said. "I may yield to force, but I will yield to nothing else. I insist on my right to the place that she has stolen from me. It's no use scolding me," she added, turning doggedly to Julian. "As long as that woman is here under my name, I can't and won't keep away from the house. I warn her, in your presence, that I have written to my friends in Canada. I dare her, before you all, to deny that she is the outcast and adventuress Mercy Merrick." The challenge forced Mercy to take part in the proceedings in her own defense. She had pledged herself to meet and defy Grace Roseberry on her own ground. She attempted to speak. Horace stopped her. "You degrade yourself if you answer her," he said. "Take my arm and let us leave the room." "Yes, take her out," cried Grace. "She may well be ashamed to face an honest woman. It's her place to leave the room, not mine." Mercy drew her hand out of Horace's arm. "I decline to leave the room," she said, quietly. Horace still tried to persuade her to withdraw. "I can't bear to hear you insulted," he rejoined. "The woman offends me, though I know she is not responsible for what she says." "Nobody's endurance will be tried much longer," said Lady Janet. She glanced at Julian, and taking from her pocket the card which he had given to her, opened the library door. "Go to the police station," she said to the servant in an undertone, "and give that card to the inspector on duty. Tell him there is not a moment to lose." "Stop," said Julian, before his aunt could close the door again. "Stop?" repeated Lady Janet sharply. "I have given the man his orders. What do you mean?" "Before you send the card, I wish to say a word in private to this lady," replied Julian, indicating Grace. "When that is done," he continued, approaching Mercy, and pointedly addressing himself to her, "I shall have a request to make. I shall ask you to give me an opportunity of speaking to you without interruption." His tone pointed the allusion. Mercy shrank from looking at him. The signs of painful agitation began to show themselves in her shifting color and her uneasy silence. Roused by Julian's significantly distant reference to what had passed between them, her better impulses were struggling already to recover their influence over her. She might, at that critical moment, have yielded to the promptings of her own nobler nature. She might have risen superior to the galling remembrance of the insults that had been heaped upon her, if Grace's malice had not seen, in her hesitation, a means of referring offensively once again to her interview with Julian Gray. "Pray don't think twice about trusting him alone with me," she said, with a sardonic affectation of politeness. "I am not interested in making a conquest of Mr. Julian Gray." The jealous distrust in Horace, already awakened by Julian's request, now attempted to assert itself openly. Before he could speak, Mercy's indignation had dictated Mercy's answer. "I am much obliged to you, Mr. Gray," she said, addressing Julian, but still not raising her eyes to his. "I have nothing more to say. There is no need for me to trouble you again." In those rash words she recalled the confession to which she stood pledged. In those rash words she committed herself to keeping the position that she had usurped, in the face of the woman whom she had deprived of it. Horace was silenced, but not satisfied. He saw Julian's eyes fixed in sad and searching attention on Mercy's face while she was speaking. He heard Julian sigh to himself when she had done. He observed Julian, after a moment's serious consideration, and a moment's glance backward at the stranger in the poor black clothes, lift his head with the air of a man who had taken a sudden resolution. "Bring me that card directly," he said to the servant. His tone announced that he was not to be trifled with. The man obeyed. Without answering Lady Janet, who still peremptorily insisted on her right to act for herself, Julian took the pencil from his pocketbook and added his signature to the writing already inscribed on the card. When he handed it back to the servant he made his apologies to his aunt. "Pardon me for venturing to interfere," he said. "There is a serious reason for what I have done, which I will explain to you at a fitter time. In the meanwhile, I offer no further obstruction to the course which you propose taking. On the contrary, I have just assisted you in gaining the end that you have in view." As he said that, he held up the pencil with which he had signed his name. Lady Janet, naturally perplexed, and, with some reason perhaps, offended as well, made no answer. She waved her hand to the servant, and sent him away with the card. There was silence in the room. The eyes of all the persons present turned more or less anxiously on Julian. Mercy was vaguely surprised and alarmed. Horace, like Lady Janet, felt offended, without clearly knowing why. Even Grace Roseberry herself was subdued by her own presentiment of some coming interference for which she was completely unprepared. Julian's words and actions, from the moment when he had written on the card, were involved in a mystery to which not one of the persons round him held the clue. The motive which had animated his conduct may, nevertheless, be described in 2 words. Julian still held to his faith in the inbred nobility of Mercy's nature. He had inferred, with little difficulty, from the language which Grace had used toward Mercy in his presence, that the injured woman must have taken pitiless advantage of her position at the interview which he had interrupted. Instead of appealing to Mercy's sympathies and Mercy's sense of right, instead of accepting the expression of her sincere contrition and encouraging her to make the completest and the speediest atonement, Grace had evidently outraged and insulted her. As a necessary result, her endurance had given way under her own sense of intolerable severity and intolerable wrong. The remedy for the mischief thus done was, as Julian had first seen it, to speak privately with Grace, to soothe her by owning that his opinion of the justice of her claims had undergone a change in her favor, and then to persuade her, in her own interests, to let him carry to Mercy such expressions of apology and regret as might lead to a friendly understanding between them. With those motives, he had made his request to be permitted to speak separately to the one and the other. The scene that had followed, the new insult offered by Grace, and the answer which it had wrung from Mercy, had convinced him that no such interference as he had contemplated would have the slightest prospect of success. The only remedy now left to try was the desperate remedy of letting things take their course, and trusting implicitly to Mercy's better nature for the result. Let her see the police officer in plain clothes enter the room. Let her understand clearly what the result of his interference would be. Let her confront the alternative of consigning Grace Roseberry to a madhouse or of confessing the truth. And what would happen? If Julian's confidence in her was a confidence soundly placed, she would nobly pardon the outrages which had been heaped upon her, and she would do justice to the woman whom she had wronged. If, on the other hand, his belief in her was nothing better than the blind belief of an infatuated man, if she faced the alternative and persisted in asserting her assumed identity, what then? Julian's faith in Mercy refused to let that darker side of the question find a place in his thoughts. It rested entirely with him to bring the officer into the house. He had prevented Lady Janet from making any mischievous use of his card by sending to the police station and warning them to attend to no message which they might receive unless the card produced bore his signature. Knowing the responsibility that he was taking on himself, knowing that Mercy had made no confession to him to which it was possible to appeal, he had signed his name without an instant's hesitation, and there he stood now, looking at the woman whose better nature he was determined to vindicate, the only calm person in the room. Horace's jealousy saw something suspiciously suggestive of a private understanding in Julian's earnest attention and in Mercy's downcast face. Having no excuse for open interference, he made an effort to part them. "You spoke just now," he said to Julian, "of wishing to say a word in private to that person." He pointed to Grace. "Shall we retire, or will you take her into the library?" "I refuse to have anything to say to him," Grace burst out, before Julian could answer. "I happen to know that he is the last person to do me justice. He has been effectually hoodwinked. If I speak to anybody privately, it ought to be you. You have the greatest interest of any of them in finding out the truth." "What do you mean?" "Do you want to marry an outcast from the streets?" Horace took one step forward toward her. There was a look in his face which plainly betrayed that he was capable of turning her out of the house with his own hands. Lady Janet stopped him. "You were right in suggesting just now that Grace had better leave the room," she said. "Let us all three go. Julian will remain here and give the man his directions when he arrives. Come." No, by a strange contradiction, it was Horace himself who now interfered to prevent Mercy from leaving the room. In the heat of his indignation, he lost all sense of his own dignity. He descended to the level of a woman whose intellect he believed to be deranged. To the surprise of everyone present, he stepped back and took from the table a jewel case which he had placed there when he came into the room. It was the wedding present from his mother which he had brought to his betrothed wife. His outraged self-esteem seized the opportunity of vindicating Mercy by a public bestowal of the gift. "Wait!" he called out sternly. "That wretch shall have her answer. She has sense enough to see and sense enough to hear. Let her see and hear." He opened the jewel case and took from it a magnificent pearl necklace in an antique setting. "Grace," he said with his highest distinction of manner, "my mother sends you her love and her congratulations on our approaching marriage. She begs you to accept, as part of your bridal dress, these pearls. She was married in them herself. They have been in our family for centuries. As one of the family, honored and beloved, My mother offers them to my wife." He lifted the necklace to clasp it round Mercy's neck. Julian watched her in breathless suspense. Would she sustain the ordeal through which Horace had innocently condemned her to pass? Yes, in the insolent presence of Grace Roseberry, what was there now that she could not sustain? Her pride was in arms. Her lovely eyes lighted up as only a woman's eyes can light up when they see jewelry. Her grand head bent gracefully to receive the necklace. Her face warmed into color. Her beauty rallied its charms. Her triumph over Grace Roseberry was complete. Julian's head sank. For one sad moment he secretly asked himself the question, "Have I been mistaken in her?" Horace arrayed her in the pearls. "Your husband puts these pearls on your neck, love," he said, proudly, and paused to look at her. "Now," he added, with a contemptuous backward glance at Grace, "we may go into the library. She has seen, and she has heard." He believed that he had silenced her. He had simply furnished her sharp tongue with a new sting. "You will hear and you will see when my proofs come from Canada," she retorted. "You will hear that your wife has stolen my name and my character. You will see your wife dismissed from this house." Mercy turned on her with an uncontrollable outburst of passion. "You are mad!" she cried. Lady Janet caught the electric infection of anger in the air of the room. She too turned on Grace. She too said it. "You are mad!" Horace followed Lady Janet. He was beside himself. He fixed his pitiless eyes on Grace, and echoed the contagious words, "You are mad!" She was silenced. She was daunted at last. The treble accusation revealed to her, for the first time, the frightful suspicion to which she had exposed herself. She shrank back with a low cry of horror, and struck against a chair. She would have fallen if Julian had not sprung forward and caught her. Lady Janet led the way into the library. She opened the door, started, and suddenly stepped aside, so as to leave the entrance free. A man appeared in the open doorway. He was not a gentleman. He was not a workman. He was not a servant. He was vilely dressed, in glossy black broadcloth. His frock coat hung on him instead of fitting him. His waistcoat was too short and too tight over the chest. His trousers were a pair of shapeless black bags. His gloves were too large for him. His highly polished boots creaked detestably whenever he moved. He had odiously watchful eyes, eyes that looked skilled in peeping through keyholes. His large ears, set forward like the ears of a monkey, pleaded guilty to meanly listening behind other people's doors. His manner was quietly confidential when he spoke, impenetrably self-possessed when he was silent. A lurking air of secret service enveloped the fellow, like an atmosphere of his own, from head to foot. He looked all round the magnificent room without betraying either surprise or admiration. He closely investigated every person in it with one glance of his cunningly watchful eyes. Making his bow to Lady Janet, he silently showed her, as his introduction, the card that had summoned him. And then he stood at ease, self-revealed in his own sinister identity, a police officer in plain clothes. Nobody spoke to him. Everybody shrank inwardly as if a reptile had crawled into the room. He looked backward and forward, perfectly unembarrassed, between Julian and Horace. "Is Mr. Julian Gray here?" he asked. Julian led Grace to a seat. Her eyes were fixed on the man. She trembled. She whispered, "Who is he?" Julian spoke to the police officer without answering her. "Wait there," he said, pointing to a chair in the most distant corner of the room. "I will speak to you directly." The man advanced to the chair, marching to the discord of his creaking boots. He privately valued the carpet at so much a yard as he walked over it. He privately valued the chair at so much the dozen as he sat down on it. He was quite at his ease. It was no matter to him whether he waited and did nothing, or whether he pried into the private character of everyone in the room, as long as he was paid for it. Even Lady Janet's resolution to act for herself was not proof against the appearance of the policeman in plain clothes. She left it to her nephew to take the lead. Julian glanced at Mercy before he stirred further in the matter. He alone knew that the end rested now, not with him, but with her. She felt his eyes on her, while her own eyes were looking at the man. She turned her head, hesitated, and suddenly approached Julian. Like Grace Roseberry, she was trembling. Like Grace Roseberry, she whispered, "Who is he?" Julian told her plainly who he was. "Why is he here?" "Can't you guess?" "No." Horace left Lady Janet and joined Mercy and Julian, impatient of the private colloquy between them. "Am I in the way?" he inquired. Julian drew back a little, understanding Horace perfectly. He looked round at Grace. Nearly the whole length of the spacious room divided them from the place in which she was sitting. She had never moved since he had placed her in a chair. The direst of all terrors was in possession of her, terror of the unknown. There was no fear of her interfering, and no fear of her hearing what they said, so long as they were careful to speak in guarded tones. Julian set the example by lowering his voice. "Ask Horace why the police officer is here," he said to Mercy. She put the question directly. "Why is he here?" Horace looked across the room at Grace and answered, "He is here to relieve us of that woman." "Do you mean that he will take her away?" "Yes." "Where will he take her to?" "To the police station." Mercy started, and looked at Julian. He was still watching the slightest changes in her face. She looked back again at Horace. "To the police station?" she repeated. "What for?" "How can you ask the question?" said Horace, irritably. "To be placed under restraint, of course." "Do you mean prison?" "I mean an asylum." Again Mercy turned to Julian. There was horror now, as well as surprise, in her face. "Oh!" she said to him. "Horace is surely wrong. It can't be." Julian left it to Horace to answer. Every facility in him seemed to be still absorbed in watching Mercy's face. She was compelled to address herself to Horace once more. "What sort of asylum?" she asked. "You don't surely mean a madhouse?" "I do," he rejoined. "The workhouse first, perhaps, and then the madhouse. What is there to surprise you in that? You yourself told her, to her face, she was mad. Good heavens, how pale you are! What is the matter?" She turned to Julian for the third time. The terrible alternative that was offered to her had showed itself at last, without reserve or disguise. Restore the identity that you have stolen, or shut her up in a madhouse. It rests with you to choose. In that form the situation shaped itself in her mind. She chose on the instant. Before she opened her lips, the higher nature in her spoke to Julian, in her eyes. The steady inner light that he had seen in them once already shone in them again, brighter and purer than before. The conscience that he had fortified, the soul that he had saved, looked at him and said, "Doubt us no more. Send that man out of the house." Those were her first words. She spoke, pointing to the police officer, in clear, ringing, resolute tones, audible in the remotest corner of the room. Julian's hand stole unobserved to hers, and told her, in its momentary pressure, to count on his brotherly sympathy and help. All the other persons in the room looked at her in speechless surprise. Grace rose from her chair. Even the man in plain clothes started to his feet. Lady Janet, hurriedly joining Horace, and fully sharing his perplexity and alarm, took Mercy impulsively by the arm, and shook it, as if to rouse her to a sense of what she was doing. Mercy held firm. Mercy resolutely repeated what she had said. "Send that man out of the house." Lady Janet lost all her patience with her. "What has come to you?" she asked, sternly. "Do you know what you are saying? The man is here in your interest, as well as in mine. The man is here to spare you, as well as me, further annoyance and insult. And you insist, in my presence, on his being sent away. What does it mean?" "You shall know what it means, Lady Janet, in half an hour. I don't insist. I only reiterate my entreaty. Let the man be sent away." Julian stepped aside, with his aunt's eyes angrily following him, and spoke to the police officer. "Go back to the station," he said, "and wait there till you hear from me." The meanly vigilant eyes of the man in plain clothes traveled sidelong from Julian to Mercy, and valued her beauty as they had valued the carpet and the chairs. "The old story," he thought. "The nice-looking woman is always at the bottom of it, and, sooner or later, the nice-looking woman has her way." He marched back across the room to the discord of his own creaking boots, bowed, with a villainous smile which put the worst construction on everything, and vanished through the library door. Lady Janet's high breeding restrained her from saying anything until the police officer was out of hearing. Then, and not till then, she appealed to Julian. "I presume you are in the secret of this?" she said. "I suppose you have some reason for setting my authority at defiance in my own house?" "I have never yet failed to respect your ladyship," Julian answered. "Before long you will know that I am not failing in respect toward you now." Lady Janet looked across the room. Grace was listening eagerly, conscious that events had taken some mysterious turn in her favor within the last minute. "Is it part of your new arrangement of my affairs," her ladyship continued, "that this person is to remain in the house?" The terror that had daunted Grace had not lost all hold of her yet. She left it to Julian to reply. Before he could speak, Mercy crossed the room and whispered to her, "Give me time to confess it in writing. I can't own it before them, with this round my neck." She pointed to the necklace. Grace cast a threatening glance at her, and suddenly looked away again in silence. Mercy answered Lady Janet's question. "I beg your ladyship to permit her to remain until the half-hour is over," she said. "My request will have explained itself by that time." Lady Janet raised no further obstacles, for something in Mercy's face, or in Mercy's tone, seemed to have silenced her, as it had silenced Grace. Horace was the next who spoke. In tones of suppressed rage and suspicion, he addressed himself to Mercy, standing fronting him by Julian's side. "Am I included," he asked, "in the arrangement which engages you to explain your extraordinary conduct in half an hour?" His hand had placed his mother's wedding present round Mercy's neck. A sharp pang wrung her as she looked at Horace, and saw how deeply she had already distressed and offended him. The tears rose in her eyes. She humbly and faintly answered him. "If you please," was all she could say, before the cruel swelling at her heart rose and silenced her. Horace's sense of injury refused to be soothed by such simple submission as this. I dislike mysteries and innuendos, he went on harshly. In my family circle, we are accustomed to meet each other frankly. Why am I to wait half an hour for an explanation which might be given now? What am I to wait for? Lady Janet recovered herself as Horace spoke. I entirely agree with you, she said. I ask, too, what are we to wait for? Even Julian's self-possession failed him when his aunt repeated that cruelly plain question. How would Mercy answer it? Would her courage still hold out? You have asked me what you are to wait for, she said to Horace, quietly and firmly. Wait to hear something more of Mercy Merrick. Lady Janet listened with a look of weary disgust. Don't return to that, she said. We know enough about Mercy Merrick already. Pardon me, your ladyship does not know. I am the only person who can inform you. You! She bent her head respectfully. I have begged you, Lady Janet, to give me half an hour, she went on. In half an hour I solemnly engage myself to produce Mercy Merrick in this room. Lady Janet Roy, Mr. Horace Holmcroft, you are to wait for that. Steadily pledging herself in those terms to make her confession, she unclasped the pearls from her neck, put them away in their cases, and placed it in Horace's hand. Keep it, she said, with a momentary faltering in her voice, until we meet again. Horace took the case in silence. He looked and acted like a man whose mind was paralyzed by surprise. His hand moved mechanically. His eyes followed Mercy with a vacant, questioning look. Lady Janet seemed, in her different way, to share the strange oppression that had fallen on him. A vague sense of dread and distress hung like a cloud over her mind. At that memorable moment she felt her age. She looked her age, as she had never felt it or looked it yet. "Have I your ladyship's leave," said Mercy, respectfully, "to go to my room?" Lady Janet mutely granted the request. Mercy's last look before she went out was a look at Grace. "Are you satisfied now?" the grand gray eyes seemed to say mournfully. Grace turned her head aside with a quick, petulant action. Even her narrow nature opened for a moment unwillingly, and let pity in a little way, in spite of itself. Mercy's parting words recommended Grace to Julian's care. "You will see that she is allowed a room to wait in? You will warn her yourself when the half hour has expired?" Julian opened the library door for her. "Well done, nobly done," he whispered. "All my sympathy is with you. All my help is yours." Her eyes looked at him and thanked him, through her gathering tears. His own eyes were dimmed. She passed quietly down the room, and was lost to him before he had shut the door again. End of chapter 20. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois.
Chapter 21 of the New Magdalen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Karen Malazzi, Massachusetts. The New Magdalen by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 21. The Footstep in the Corridor. Mercy was alone. She had secured 1/2 hour of retirement in her own room, designing to devote that interval to the writing of her confession, in the form of a letter addressed to Julian Gray. No recent change in her position had as yet mitigated her horror of acknowledging to Horace and to Lady Janet that she had won her way to their hearts in disguise. Through Julian only could she say the words which were to establish Grace Roseberry in her right position in the house. How was her confession to be addressed to him, in writing or by word of mouth? After all that had happened, from the time when Lady Janet's appearance had interrupted them, she would have felt relief rather than embarrassment in personally opening her heart to the man who had so delicately understood her, who had so faithfully befriended her in her sorest need. but the repeated betrayals of Horace's jealous suspicion of Julian warned her that she would only be surrounding herself with new difficulties, and be placing Julian in a position of painful embarrassment if she admitted him to a private interview while Horace was in the house. The one course left to take was the course that she had adopted. Determining to address the narrative of the fraud to Julian in the form of a letter, she arranged to add at the close certain instructions, pointing out to him the line of conduct which she wished him to pursue. These instructions contemplated the communication of her letter to Lady Janet and to Horace in the library, while Mercy, self-confessed as the missing woman whom she had pledged herself to produce, awaited in the adjoining room whatever sentence it pleased them to pronounce on her. Her resolution not to screen herself behind Julian from any consequences which might follow the confession had taken root in her mind from the moment when Horace had harshly asked her, and when Lady Janet had joined him in asking, why she delayed her explanation, and what she was keeping them waiting for. Out of the very pain which those questions inflicted, the idea of waiting her sentence in her own person in one room, while her letter to Julian was speaking for her in another, had sprung to life. Let them break my heart if they like, she had thought to herself in the self-abasement of that bitter moment, and it will be no more than I have deserved. She locked her door and opened her writing desk. Knowing what she had to do, she tried to collect herself and do it. The effort was in vain. Those persons who study writing as an art are probably the only persons who can measure the vast distance which separates a conception as it exists in the mind from the reduction of that conception to form and shape in words. The heavy stress of agitation that had been laid on Mercy for hours together had utterly unfitted her for the delicate and difficult process of arranging the events of a narrative in their due sequence and their due proportion toward each other. Again and again she tried to begin her letter, and again she was baffled by the same hopeless confusion of ideas. She gave up the struggle in despair. A sense of sinking at her heart, a weight of hysterical oppression on her bosom, warned her not to leave herself unoccupied, a prey to morbid self-investigation and imaginary alarms. She turned instinctively for a temporary employment of some kind to the consideration of her own future. Here there were no intricacies or entanglements. The prospect began and ended with her return to the refuge, if the matron would receive her. She did no injustice to Julian Gray. That great heart would feel for her, that kind hand would be held out to her, she knew. But what would happen if she thoughtlessly accepted all that his sympathy might offer? Scandal would point to her beauty and to his youth, and would place its own vile interpretation on the purest friendship that could exist between them. And he would be the sufferer, for he had a character, a clergyman's character, to lose. No, for his sake, out of gratitude to him, the farewell to Maplethorpe House must also be the farewell to Julian Gray. The precious minutes were passing. She resolved to write to the matron and ask if she might hope to be forgiven and employed at the refuge again. Occupation over the letter that was easy to write might have its fortifying effect on her mind, and might pave the way for resuming the letter that was hard to write. She waited a moment at the window, thinking of the past life to which she was soon to return, before she took up the pen again. Her window looked eastward. The dusky glare of lighted London met her as her eyes rested on the sky. It seemed to beckon her back to the horror of the cruel streets, to point her way mockingly to the bridges over the Black River, to lure her to the top of the parapet and the dreadful leap into God's arms, or into annihilation, who knew which? She turned, shuddering, from the window. Will it end in that way, she asked herself, if the matron says no? She began her letter. Dear Madam, so long a time has passed since you heard from me that I almost shrink from writing to you. I am afraid you have already given me up in your own mind as a hard-hearted, ungrateful woman. I have been leading a false life. I have not been fit to write to you before today. Now, when I am doing what I can to atone to those whom I have injured, now, when I repent with my whole heart, may I ask leave to return to the friend who has borne with me and helped me through many miserable years? Oh, madam, do not cast me off. I have no one to turn to but you. Will you let me own everything to you? Will you forgive me when you know what I have done? Will you take me back into the refuge if you have any employment for me by which I may earn my shelter and my bread? Before the night comes, I must leave the house from which I am now writing. I have nowhere to go to. The little money, the few valuable possessions I have, must be left behind me. They have been obtained under false pretenses. They are not mine. No more forlorn creature than I am lives at this moment. You are a Christian woman. Not for my sake, for Christ's sake. Pity me, and take me back. I am a good nurse, as you know, and I am a quick worker with my needle. In one way or the other, can you not find occupation for me? I could also teach in a very unpretending way, but that is useless. Who would trust their children to a woman without a character? There is no hope for me in this direction. And yet, I am so fond of children. I think I could be not happy again, perhaps, but content with my lot if I could be associated with them in some way. Are there not charitable societies which are trying to help and protect destitute children wandering about the streets? I think of my own wretched childhood, and oh, I should so like to be employed in saving other children from ending as I have ended. I could work for such an object as that from morning to night and never feel weary. All my heart would be in it, and I should have this advantage over happy and prosperous women. I should have nothing else to think of. Surely they might trust me with the poor little starving wanderers of the streets, if you said a word for me. If I am asking too much, please forgive me. I am so wretched, madam, so lonely, and so weary of my life. There is only one thing more. My time here is very short. Will you please reply to this letter, to say yes or no, by telegram? The name by which you know me is not the name by which I have been known here. I must beg you to address the telegram to the Reverend Julian Gray, Mablethorpe House, Kensington. He is here, and he will show it to me. No words of mine can describe what I owe to him. He has never despaired of me. He has saved me from myself. God bless and reward the kindest, truest, best man I have ever known. I have no more to say, except to ask you to excuse this long letter, and to believe me your grateful servant. She signed and enclosed the letter, and wrote the address. Then, for the first time, an obstacle which she ought to have seen before showed itself, standing straight in her way. There was no time to forward her letter in the ordinary manner by post. It must be taken to its destination by a private messenger. Lady Janet's servants had hitherto been, one and all, at her disposal. Could she presume to employ them on her own affairs, when she might be dismissed from the house, a disgraced woman, in half an hour's time? Of the two alternatives it seemed better to take her chance, and present herself at the Refuge without asking leave first. While she was still considering the question, she was startled by a knock at her door. On opening it, she admitted Lady Janet's maid, with a morsel of folded note-paper in her hand. "From my lady, miss," said the woman, giving her the note. "There is no answer." Mercy stopped her as she was about to leave the room. The appearance of the maid suggested an inquiry to her. She asked if any of the servants were likely to be going into town that afternoon. "Yes, miss. One of the grooms is going on horseback, with a message to her ladyship's coachmaker." The Refuge was close by the coachmaker's place of business. Under the circumstances, Mercy was emboldened to make use of the man. It was a pardonable liberty to employ his services now. "Will you kindly give the groom that letter for me?" she said. "It will not take him out of his way. He has only to deliver it, nothing more." The woman willingly complied with the request. Left once more by herself, Mercy looked at the little note which had been placed in her hands. It was the first time that her benefactress had employed this formal method of communicating with her when they were both in the house. What did such a departure from established habits mean? Had she received her notice of dismissal? Had Lady Janet's quick intelligence found its way already to a suspicion of the truth? Mercy's nerves were unstrung. She trembled pitiably as she opened the folded note. It began without a form of address, and it ended without a signature. Thus it ran: "I must request you to delay for a little while the explanation which you have promised me. At my age, painful surprises are very trying things. I must have time to compose myself before I can hear what you have to say. You shall not be kept waiting longer than I can help. In the meanwhile, everything will go on as usual. My nephew Julian, and Horace Holmcroft, and the lady whom I found in the dining-room, will, by my desire, remain in the house until I am able to meet them, and to meet you again." There the note ended. To what conclusion did it point? Had Lady Janet really guessed the truth? Or had she only surmised that her adopted daughter was connected in some discreditable manner with the mystery of Mercy Merrick? The line in which she referred to the intruder in the dining-room as "the lady" showed very remarkably that her opinions had undergone a change in that quarter. But was the phrase enough of itself to justify the inference that she had actually anticipated the nature of Mercy's confession? It was not easy to decide that doubt at the moment, and it proved to be equally difficult to throw any light on it at an after-time. To the end of her life Lady Janet resolutely refused to communicate to anyone the conclusions which she might have privately formed, the griefs which she might have secretly stifled on that memorable day. Amid much, however, which was beset with uncertainty, one thing at least was clear. The time at Mercy's disposal in her own room had been indefinitely prolonged by Mercy's benefactress. Hours might pass before the disclosure to which she stood committed would be expected from her. In those hours she might surely compose her mind sufficiently to be able to write her letter of confession to Julian Gray. Once more she placed the sheet of paper before her. Resting her head on her hand as she sat at the table, she tried to trace her way through the labyrinth of the past, beginning with the day when she had met Grace Roseberry in the French cottage, and ending with the day which had brought them face to face for the second time in the dining-room at Mablethorpe House. The chain of events began to unroll itself in her mind clearly, link by link. She remarked, as she pursued the retrospect, how strangely chance or fate had paved the way for the act of personation in the first place. If they had met under ordinary circumstances, neither Mercy nor Grace would have trusted each other with the confidences which had been exchanged between them. As the event had happened, they had come together under those extraordinary circumstances of common trial and common peril, in a strange country which would especially predispose two women of the same nation to open their hearts to each other. In no other way could Mercy have obtained at a first interview that fatal knowledge of Grace's position and Grace's affairs, which had placed temptation before her as the necessary consequence that followed the bursting of the German shell. Advancing from this point through the succeeding series of events which had so naturally and yet so strangely favored the perpetration of the fraud, Mercy reached the later period when Grace had followed her to England. Here again she remarked, in the second place, how chance or fate had once more paved the way for that second meeting which had confronted them with one another at Mablethorpe House. She had, as she well remembered, attended at a certain assembly, convened by a charitable society, in the character of Lady Janet's representative at Lady Janet's own request. For that reason she had been absent from the house when Grace had entered it. If her return had been delayed by a few minutes only, Julian would have had time to take Grace out of the room, and the terrible meeting which had stretched Mercy senseless on the floor would never have taken place. As the event had happened, the period of her absence had been fatally shortened by what appeared at the time to be the commonest possible occurrence. The persons assembled at the Society's rooms had disagreed so seriously on the business which had brought them together as to render it necessary to take the ordinary course of adjourning the proceedings to a future day. And chance or fate had so timed that adjournment as to bring Mercy back into the dining-room exactly at the moment when Grace Roseberry insisted on being confronted with the woman who had taken her place. She had never yet seen the circumstances in this sinister light. She was alone in her room at a crisis in her life. She was worn and weakened by emotions which had shaken her to the soul. Little by little she felt the enervating influences let loose on her in her lonely position by her new train of thought. Little by little her heart began to sink under the stealthy chill of superstitious dread. Vaguely horrible presentiments throbbed in her with her pulses, flowed through her with her blood. Mystic oppressions of hidden disaster hovered over her in the atmosphere of the room. The cheerful candlelight turned traitor to her and grew dim. Supernatural murmurs trembled round the house in the moaning of the winter wind. She was afraid to look behind her. On a sudden she felt her own cold hands covering her face, without knowing when she had lifted them to it, or why. Still helpless under the horror that held her, she suddenly heard footsteps, a man's footsteps, in the corridor outside. At other times the sound would have startled her. Now it broke the spell. The footsteps suggested life, companionship, human interposition, no matter of what sort. She mechanically took up her pen. She found herself beginning to remember her letter to Julian Gray. At the same moment the footsteps stopped outside her door. The man knocked. She still felt shaken. She was hardly mistress of herself yet. A faint cry of alarm escaped her at the sound of the knock. Before it could be repeated she had rallied her courage and had opened the door. The man in the corridor was Horace Holmcroft. His ruddy complexion had turned pale. His hair, of which he was especially careful at other times, was in disorder. The superficial polish of his manner was gone. The undisguised man, sullen, distrustful, irritated to the last degree of endurance, showed through. He looked at her with a watchfully suspicious eye. He spoke to her, without preface or apology, in a coldly angry voice. "Are you aware," he asked, "of what is going on downstairs?" "I have not left my room," she answered. "I know that Lady Janet has deferred the explanation which I had promised to give her, and I know no more." "Has nobody told you what Lady Janet did after you left us? Has nobody told you that she politely placed her own boudoir at the disposal of the very woman whom she had ordered half an hour before to leave the house? Do you really not know that Mr. Julian Gray has himself conducted this suddenly honored guest to her place of retirement, and that I am left alone in the midst of these changes, contradictions, and mysteries, the only person who is kept out in the dark?" "It is surely needless to ask me these questions," said Mercy gently. "Who could possibly have told me what was going on below stairs before you knocked at my door?" He looked at her with an ironical affectation of surprise. "You are strangely forgetful today," he said. "Surely your friend Mr. Julian Gray might have told you. I am astonished to hear that he has not had his private interview yet." "I don't understand you, Horace." "I don't want you to understand me," he retorted irritably. "The proper person to understand me is Julian Gray. I look to him to account to me for the confidential relations which seem to have been established between you behind my back. He has avoided me thus far, but I shall find my way to him yet." His manner threatened more than his words expressed. In Mercy's nervous condition at the moment, it suggested to her that he might attempt to fasten a quarrel on Julian Gray. "You are entirely mistaken," she said, warmly. "You are ungratefully doubting your best and truest friend. I say nothing of myself. You will soon discover why I patiently submit to suspicions which other women would resent as an insult." "Let me discover it at once, now, without wasting a moment more." There had hitherto been some little distance between them. Mercy had listened, waiting on the threshold of her door. Horace had spoken, standing against the opposite wall of the corridor. When he said his last words, he suddenly stepped forward, and with something imperative in the gesture, laid his hand on her arm. The strong grasp of it almost hurt her. She struggled to release herself. "Let me go," she said. "What do you mean?" He dropped her arm as suddenly as he had taken it. "You shall know what I mean," he replied. "A woman who has grossly outraged and insulted you, whose only excuse is that she is mad, is detained in the house at your desire, I might almost say at your command, when the police officer is waiting to take her away. I have a right to know what this means. I am engaged to marry you. If you won't trust other people, you are bound to explain yourself to me. I refuse to wait for Lady Janet's convenience. I insist, if you force me to say so, I insist on knowing the real nature of your connection with this affair. You have obliged me to follow you here. It is my only opportunity of speaking to you. You avoid me. You shut yourself up from me in your own room. I am not your husband yet. I have no right to follow you in. But there are other rooms open to us. The library is at our disposal, and I will take care that we are not interrupted. I am now going there, and I have a last question to ask. You are to be my wife in a week's time. Will you take me into your confidence or not?" To hesitate was, in this case, literally to be lost. Mercy's sense of justice told her that Horace had claimed no more than his due. She answered instantly, "I will follow you to the library, Horace, in 5 minutes." Her prompt and frank compliance with his wishes surprised and touched him. He took her hand. She had endured all that his angry sense of injury could say. His gratitude wounded her to the quick. The bitterest moment she had felt yet was the moment in which he raised her hand to his lips and murmured tenderly, "My own true Grace." She could only sign to him to leave her and hurry back into her own room. Her first feeling, when she found herself alone again, was wonder. Wonder that it should never have occurred to her, until he had himself suggested it, that her betrothed husband had the foremost right to her confession. Her horror at owning to either of them that she had cheated them out of their love had hitherto placed Horace and Lady Janet on the same level. She now saw for the first time that there was no comparison between the claims which they respectively had on her. She owed an alliance to Horace to which Lady Janet could assert no right. Cost her what it might to avow the truth to him with her own lips, the cruel sacrifice must be made. Without a moment's hesitation, she put away her writing materials. It amazed her that she should ever have thought of using Julian Gray as an interpreter between the man to whom she was betrothed and herself. Julian's sympathy, she thought, must have made a strong impression on her indeed to bind her to a duty which was beyond all compromise, which admitted of no dispute. She had asked for 5 minutes of delay before she followed Horace. It was too long a time. Her one chance of finding courage to crush him with the dreadful revelation of who she really was, of what she had really done, was to plunge headlong into the disclosure without giving herself time to think. The shame of it would overpower her if she gave herself time to think. She turned to the door to follow him at once. Even at that terrible moment, the most ineradicable of all a woman's instincts, the instinct of personal self-respect, brought her to a pause. She had passed through more than one terrible trial since she had dressed to go downstairs. Remembering this, she stopped mechanically, retraced her steps, and looked at herself in the glass. There was no motive of vanity in what she now did. The action was as unconscious as if she had buttoned an unfastened glove or shaken out a crumpled dress. Not the faintest idea crossed her mind of looking to see if her beauty might still plead for her, and of trying to set it off at its best. A momentary smile, the most weary, the most hopeless that ever saddened a woman's face, appeared in the reflection which her mirror gave her back. Haggard, ghastly, old before my time, she said to herself. Well, better so. He will feel it less. He will not regret me. With that thought, she went downstairs to meet him in the library. End of chapter 21. Recording by Karen Malazzi, Massachusetts.
Chapter 22 of the New Magdalen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The New Magdalen by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 22. The Man in the Dining Room. In the great emergencies of life, we feel or we act as our dispositions incline us. But we never think. Mercy's mind was a blank as she descended the stairs. On her way down, she was conscious of nothing but the one headlong impulse to get to the library in the shortest possible space of time. Arrived at the door, the impulse capriciously left her. She stopped on the mat, wondering why she had hurried herself with time to spare. Her heart sank. The fever of her excitement changed suddenly to a chill as she faced the closed door, and asked herself the question, "Dare I go in?" Her own hand answered her. She lifted it to turn the handle of the lock. It dropped again helplessly at her side. The sense of her own irresolution wrung from her a low exclamation of despair. Faint as it was, it had apparently not passed unheard. The door was opened from within, and Horace stood before her. He drew aside to let her pass into the room, but he never followed her in. He stood in the doorway and spoke to her, keeping the door open with his hand. "Do you mind waiting here for me?" he asked. She looked at him in vacant surprise, doubting whether she had heard him aright. "It will not be for long," he went on. "I am far too anxious to hear what you have to tell me to submit to any needless delays. The truth is, I have had a message from Lady Janet." From Lady Janet? What could Lady Janet want with him, at a time when she was bent on composing herself in the retirement of her own room? "I ought to have said 2 messages," Horace proceeded. "The first was given to me on my way downstairs. Lady Janet wished to see me immediately. I sent an excuse. A second message followed. Lady Janet would accept no excuse. If I refused to go to her, I should be merely obliging her to come to me. It is impossible to risk being interrupted in that way. My only alternative is to get the thing over as soon as possible. Do you mind waiting?" "Certainly not. Have you any idea of what Lady Janet wants with you?" "No. Whatever it is, she shall not keep me long away from you. You will be quite alone here. I have warned the servants not to show anyone in." With those words he left her. Mercy's first sensation was a sensation of relief, soon lost in a feeling of shame at the weakness which could welcome any temporary relief in such a position as hers. The emotion thus roused merged in its turn into a sense of impatient regret. "But for Lady Janet's message," she thought to herself, "I might have known my fate by this time." The slow minutes followed each other drearily. She paced to and fro in the library, faster and faster, under the intolerable irritation, the maddening uncertainty of her own suspense. Ere long, even the spacious room seemed to be too small for her. The sober monotony of the long book-lined shelves oppressed and offended her. She threw open the door which led into the dining-room and dashed in, eager for a change of objects, athirst for more space and more air. At the first step she checked herself, rooted to the spot under a sudden revulsion of feeling which quieted her in an instant. The room was only illuminated by the waning firelight. A man was obscurely visible, seated on the sofa, with his elbows on his knees and his head resting on his hands. He looked up as the open door let in the lights from the library lamps. The mellow glow reached his face and revealed Julian Gray. Mercy was standing with her back to the light, her face being necessarily hidden in deep shadow. He recognized her by her figure and by the attitude into which it unconsciously fell. That unsought grace, that lithe, long beauty of line, belonged to but one woman in the house. He rose and approached her. "I've been wishing to see you," he said, and hoping that accident might bring about some such meeting as this. He offered her a chair. Mercy hesitated before she took her seat. This was their first meeting alone since Lady Janet had interrupted her at the moment when she was about to confide to Julian the melancholy story of the past. Was he anxious to seize the opportunity of returning to her confession? The terms in which he had addressed her seemed to imply it. She put the question to him in plain words. "I feel the deepest interest in hearing all that you have still to confide to me," he answered. "But anxious as I may be, I will not hurry you. I will wait, if you wish it." "I am afraid I must own that I do wish it," Mercy rejoined. "Not on my account, but because my time is at the disposal of Horace Holmcroft. I expect to see him in a few minutes." "Could you give me those few minutes?" Julian asked. "I have something on my side to say to you which I think you ought to know before you see anyone, Horace himself included." He spoke with a certain depression of tone which was not associated with her previous experience of him. His face looked prematurely old and careworn in the red light of the fire. Something had plainly happened to sadden and to disappoint him since they had last met. "I willingly offer you all the time that I have at my own command," Mercy replied. "Does what you have to tell me relate to Lady Janet?" He gave her no direct reply. "What I have to tell you of Lady Janet," he said gravely, "is soon told. So far as she is concerned, you have nothing more to dread. Lady Janet knows all." Even the heavy weight of oppression caused by the impending interview with Horace failed to hold its place in Mercy's mind when Julian answered her in those words. "Come into the lighted room," she said faintly. "It is too terrible to hear you say that in the dark." Julian followed her into the library. Her limbs trembled under her. She dropped into a chair and shrank under his great bright eyes as he stood by her side looking sadly down on her. "Lady Janet knows all," she repeated, with her head on her breast and the tears falling slowly over her cheeks. "Have you told her?" "I have said nothing to Lady Janet, or to anyone. Your confidence is a sacred confidence to me, until you have spoken first." "Has Lady Janet said anything to you?" "Not a word. She has looked at you with the vigilant eyes of love. She has listened to you with the quick hearing of love, and she has found her own way to the truth. She will not speak of it to me. She will not speak of it to any living creature. I only know now how dearly she loved you. In spite of herself, she clings to you still. Her life, poor soul, has been a barren one, unworthy, miserably unworthy, of such a nature as hers. Her marriage was loveless and childless. She has had admirers, but never, in the higher sense of the word, a friend. All the best years of her life have been wasted in the unsatisfied longing for something to love. At the end of her life you have filled the void. Her heart has found its youth again, through you. At her age, at any age, is such a tie as this to be rudely broken by the mere bidding of circumstances? No. She will suffer anything, risk anything, forgive anything, rather than own, even to herself, that she has been deceived in you. There is more than her happiness at stake. There is pride, a noble pride, in such love as hers, which will ignore the plainest discovery and deny the most unanswerable truth. I am firmly convinced, from my own knowledge of her character and from what I have observed in her to-day, that she will find some excuse for refusing to hear your confession. And more than that, I believe, if the exertion of her influence can do it, that she will leave no means untried of preventing you from acknowledging your true position here to any living creature. I take a serious responsibility on myself in telling you this, and I don't shrink from it. You ought to know, and you shall know, what trials and what temptations may yet lie before you." He paused, leaving Mercy time to compose herself if she wished to speak to him. She felt that there was a necessity for her speaking to him. He was plainly not aware that Lady Janet had already written to her to defer her promised explanation. This circumstance was in itself a confirmation of the opinion which he had expressed. She ought to mention it to him. She tried to mention it to him, but she was not equal to the effort. The few simple words in which he had touched on the tie that bound Lady Janet to her had wrung her heart. Her tears choked her. She could only sign to him to go on. "You may wonder at my speaking so positively," he continued, "with nothing better than my own conviction to justify me. I can only say that I have watched Lady Janet too closely to feel any doubt. I saw the moment in which the truth flashed on her as plainly as I now see you. It did not disclose itself gradually. It burst on her, as it burst on me. She suspected nothing. She was frankly indignant at your sudden interference and your strange language, until the time came in which you pledged yourself to produce Mercy Merrick. Then, and then only, the truth broke on her mind, trebly revealed to her in your words, your voice, and your look. Then, and then only, I saw a marked change come over her, and remain in her while she remained in the room. I dread to think of what she may do in the first reckless despair of the discovery that she has made. I distrust, though God knows I am not naturally a suspicious man, the most apparently trifling events that are now taking place about us. You have held nobly to your resolution to own the truth. Prepare yourself before the evening is over to be tried and tempted again." Mercy lifted her head. Fear took the place of grief in her eyes as they rested in startling inquiry on Julian's face. "How is it possible that temptation can come to me now?" she asked. "I will leave it to events to answer that question," he said. "You will not have long to wait. In the meantime I have put you on your guard." He stooped and spoke his next words earnestly, close at her ear. "Hold fast by the admirable courage which you have shown thus far," he went on. "Suffer anything rather than suffer the degradation of yourself. Be the woman whom I once spoke of, the woman I still have in my mind, who can nobly reveal the noble nature that is in her. And never forget this, my faith in you is as firm as ever." She looked at him proudly and gratefully. "I am pledged to justify your faith in me," she said. "I have put it out of my own power to yield. Horace has my promise that I will explain everything to him in this room." Julian started. "Has Horace himself asked it of you?" he inquired. "He at least has no suspicion of the truth." "Horace has appealed to my duty to him as his betrothed wife," she answered. "He has the first claim to my confidence. He resents my silence, and he has a right to resent it. Terrible as it will be to open his eyes to the truth, I must do it if he asks me." She was looking at Julian while she spoke. The old longing to associate with the hard trial of the confession the one man who had felt for her and believed in her revived under another form. If she could only know, while she was saying the fatal words to Horace, that Julian was listening too, she would be encouraged to meet the worst that could happen. As the idea crossed her mind, she observed that Julian was looking toward the door through which they had lately passed. In an instant she saw the means to her end. Hardly waiting to hear the few kind expressions of sympathy and approval which he addressed to her, she hinted timidly at the proposal which she had now to make to him. "Are you going back into the next room?" she asked. "Not if you object to it," he replied. "I don't object. I want you to be there." "After Horace has joined you?" "Yes, after Horace has joined me." "Do you wish to see me when it is over?" She summoned her resolution, and told him frankly what she had in her mind. "I want you to be near me while I am speaking to Horace," she said. "It will give me courage if I can feel that I am speaking to you as well as to him. I can count on your sympathy, and sympathy is so precious to me now. Am I asking too much if I ask you to leave the door unclosed when you go back to the dining room? Think of the dreadful trial, to him as well as to me. I am only a woman. I am afraid I may sink under it if I have no friend near me, and I have no friend but you." In those simple words she tried her powers of persuasion on him for the first time. Between perplexity and distress, Julian was, for the moment, at a loss how to answer her. The love for Mercy which he dared not acknowledge was as vital a feeling in him as the faith in her which he had been free to avow. To refuse anything that she asked of him in her sore need, and, more even than that, to refuse to hear the confession which it had been her first impulse to make to him, those were cruel sacrifices to his sense of what was due to Horace and of what was due to himself. But shrink as he might, even from the appearance of deserting her, it was impossible for him, except under a reserve which was almost equivalent to a denial, to grant her request. "All that I can do I will do," he said. "The door shall be left unclosed, and I will remain in the next room on this condition, that Horace knows of it as well as you. I should be unworthy of your confidence in me if I consented to be a listener on any other terms. You understand that, I am sure, as well as I do." She had never thought of her proposal to him in this light. Woman-like, she had thought of nothing but the comfort of having him near her. She understood him now. A faint flush of shame rose on her pale cheeks as she thanked him. He delicately relieved her of her embarrassment by putting a question which naturally occurred under the circumstances. "Where is Horace all this time?" he asked. "Why is he not here?" "He has been called away," she answered, "by a message from Lady Janet." The reply more than astonished Julian. It seemed almost to alarm him. He returned to Mercy's chair. He said to her eagerly, "Are you sure? Horace himself told me that Lady Janet had insisted on seeing him." "When?" "Not long ago. He asked me to wait for him here while he went upstairs." Julian's face darkened ominously. "This confirms my worst fears," he said. "Have you had any communication with Lady Janet?" Mercy replied by showing him his aunt's note. He read it carefully through. "Did I not tell you," he said, "that she would find some excuse for refusing to hear your confession? She begins by delaying it, simply to gain time for something else which she has it in her mind to do." "When did you receive this note?" "Soon after you went upstairs?" "About a quarter of an hour after, as well as I can guess. Do you know what happened down here after you left us?" "Horace told me that Lady Janet had offered Miss Roseberry the use of her boudoir." "Any more?" "He said that you had shown her the way to the room." "Did he tell you what happened after that?" "No." "Then I must tell you. If I can do nothing more in this serious state of things, I can at least prevent your being taken by surprise. In the first place, it is right you should know that I had a motive for accompanying Miss Roseberry to the boudoir. I was anxious, for your sake, to make some appeal to her better self, if she had any better self to address. I own I had doubts of my success, judging by what I had already seen of her. My doubts were confirmed. In the ordinary intercourse of life, I should merely have thought her a commonplace, uninteresting woman. Seeing her as I saw her while we were alone, in other words, penetrating below the surface, I have never, in all my sad experience, met with such a hopelessly narrow, mean, and low nature as hers. Understanding, as she could not fail to do, what the sudden change in Lady Janet's behaviour toward her really meant, her one idea was to take the cruellest possible advantage of it. So far from feeling any consideration for you, she was only additionally embittered toward you. She protested against your being permitted to claim the merit of placing her in her right position here by your own voluntary avowal of the truth. She insisted on publicly denouncing you, and on forcing Lady Janet to dismiss you, unheard, before the whole household. Now I can have my revenge. At last Lady Janet is afraid of me. Those were her own words. I am almost ashamed to repeat them. Those, on my honour, were her own words. Every possible humiliation to be heaped on you. No consideration to be shown for Lady Janet's age and Lady Janet's position. Nothing, absolutely nothing, to be allowed to interfere with Miss Roseberry's vengeance and Miss Roseberry's triumph. There is this woman's shameless view of what is due to her, as stated by herself in the plainest terms. I kept my temper. I did all I could to bring her to a better frame of mind. I might as well have pleaded, I won't say with a savage. Savages are sometimes accessible to remonstrance, if you know how to reach them. I might as well have pleaded with a hungry animal, to abstain from eating while food was within its reach. I had just given up the hopeless effort in disgust, when Lady Janet's maid appeared with a message for Miss Roseberry from her mistress. "My lady's compliments, ma'am, and she will be glad to see you at your earliest convenience in her room." Another surprise! Grace Roseberry invited to an interview with Lady Janet. It would have been impossible to believe it if Julian had not heard the invitation given with his own ears. She instantly rose. Julian proceeded. "I won't keep her ladyship waiting a moment," she said. "Show me the way." She signed to the maid to go out of the room first, and then turned round and spoke to me from the door. I despair of describing the insolent exaltation of her manner. I can only repeat her words. This is exactly what I wanted. I had intended to insist on seeing Lady Janet. She saves me the trouble. I am infinitely obliged to her. With that she nodded to me and closed the door. I have not seen her. I have not heard of her since. For all I know, She may be still with my aunt, and Horace may have found her there when he entered the room. What can Lady Janet have to say to her?" Mercy asked eagerly. "It is impossible even to guess. When you found me in the dining room I was considering that very question. I cannot imagine that any neutral ground can exist on which it is possible for Lady Janet and this woman to meet. In her present frame of mind, she will in all probability insult Lady Janet before she has been 5 minutes in the room. I own I am completely puzzled. The one conclusion I can arrive at is that the note which my aunt sent to you, the private interview with Miss Roseberry which has followed, and the summons to Horace which has succeeded in its turn, are all links in the same chain of events, and are all tending to that renewed temptation against which I have already warned you." Mercy held up her hand for silence. She looked toward the door that opened on the hall. Had she heard a footstep outside? No, all was still. Not a sign yet of Horace's return. "Oh," she exclaimed, "what would I not give to know what is going on upstairs!" "You will soon know it now," said Julian. "It is impossible that our present uncertainty can last much longer." He turned away, intending to go back to the room in which he had found him. Looking at her situation from a man's point of view, he naturally assumed that the best service he could now render to Mercy would be to leave her to prepare herself for the interview with Horace. Before he had taken 3 steps away from her, she showed him the difference between the woman's point of view and the man's. The idea of considering beforehand what she should say never entered her mind. In her horror of being left by herself at that critical moment she forgot every other consideration. Even the warning remembrance of Horace's jealous distrust of Julian passed away from her for the moment, as completely as if it never had a place in her memory. "Don't leave me," she cried. "I can't wait here alone. Come back, come back." She rose impulsively while she spoke, as if to follow him into the dining room, if he persisted in leaving her. A momentary expression of doubt crossed Julian's face as he retraced his steps and signed to her to be seated again. Could she be depended on, he asked himself, to sustain the coming test of her resolution, when she had not courage enough to wait for events in a room by herself? Julian had yet to learn that a woman's courage rises with the greatness of the emergency. Ask her to accompany you through a field in which some harmless cattle happen to be grazing, and it is doubtful in 9 cases out of 10 if she will do it. Ask her, as one of the passengers in a ship on fire, to help in setting an example of composure to the rest, and it is certain in 9 cases out of 10 that she will do it. As soon as Julian had taken a chair near her, Mercy was calm again. "Are you sure of your resolution?" he asked. "I am certain of it," she answered, "as long as you don't leave me by myself." The talk between them dropped there. They sat together in silence, with their eyes fixed on the door, waiting for Horace to come in. After the lapse of a few minutes, their attention was attracted by a sound outside in the grounds. A carriage of some sort was plainly audible approaching the house. The carriage stopped, the bell rang, the front door was opened. Had a visitor arrived? No voice could be heard making inquiries. No footsteps but the servant's footsteps crossed the hall. A long pause followed. The carriage remained at the door. Instead of bringing someone to the house, it had apparently arrived to take someone away. The next event was the return of the servant to the front door. They listened again. Again no second footstep was audible. The door was closed. The servant recrossed the hall. The carriage was driven away. Judging by sounds alone, no one had arrived at the house, and no one had left the house. Julian looked at Mercy. "Do you understand this?" he asked. She silently shook her head. "If any person has gone away in the carriage," Julian went on, "that person can hardly have been a man, or we must have heard him in the hall." The conclusion which her companion had just drawn from the noiseless departure of the supposed visitor raised a sudden doubt in Mercy's mind. "Go and inquire," she said eagerly. Julian left the room and returned again after a brief absence, with signs of grave anxiety in his face and manner. "I told you I dreaded the most trifling events that were passing about us," he said. "An event which is far from being trifling has just happened. The carriage which we heard approaching along the drive turns out to have been a cab sent for from this house. The person who has gone away in it is a woman, as you supposed?" "Yes." Mercy rose excitedly from her chair. "It can't be Grace Roseberry!" she exclaimed. "It is Grace Roseberry." "Has she gone away alone?" "Alone, after an interview with Lady Janet." "Did she go willingly?" "She herself sent the servant for the cab." "What does it mean?" "It is useless to inquire. We shall soon know." They resumed their seats, waiting as they had waited already, with their eyes on the library door. CHAPTER 23